Memory is important. What's your earliest memory? Take a moment. Think about it. For me, my earliest memory is little more than a fragment. It's just a brief mental clip. It's like several frames of film cut from a larger movie. As best I can date it, I was about 2.5 at the time. In my memory, I'm walking beside my mother, who's carrying my sister. She's not even a toddler yet. We're in a pine forest, hiking down a wide mountain trail. The trail is rocky and uneven. As I walk, I noticed a dead branch that has fallen across the path. It's thick and twisted. I pick it up and start using it as a walking stick, but it's awkward and heavy and difficult for me to manage. Because I'm preoccupied with a stick, I don't watch where I'm going, and twice I stumble over the rocks, falling to my knees, banging my bone. Irritated, I get up and grip the stick more firmly. I grab it angrily and I stab it angrily into the ground, only to lose control of it so that it falls between my feet, tripping me again. I fall a third time and grunt in frustration. "Oh, just throw that thing away," my mother says. "It's too big for you." I ignore her. It doesn't matter that I know that she's right. Her words irritate me. I was already in a bad mood because I'd fallen and bruised my knee. But by now I'm seething. Rather than acknowledge either to my mother or to myself that I've failed, I push forward, determined to make the stick work. Stubbornly, I shift the stick around so that I can carry it with both hands. It takes my total attention, but I continue to walk, stabbing the stick occasionally into the ground. That's it. That's my whole memory. It stops there. Looking back on it now, I can see myself continuing like that, a somewhat pompous little guy, focused, determined, resolute, self-contained. Memory is important, and this is my earliest one. It's my first image of myself as a self-aware person. And sad to say, I recognize that little guy as very much who I still am. Oh, I've changed in many ways. But that resolute, determined, ill-tempered little guy is still there. He's inside me somewhere. So much of how we see ourselves depend on what we remember and how we remember it. From my perspective, my life didn't begin at birth. It began with a walk in the woods. It's this that forms the opening paragraph of my account of how I see myself. What follows builds on that. That's one of the stories I carry. But we are all made up of other stories too. Also part of us are the larger stories we're part of, the stories of those who helped us to form our stories. Parents and siblings, extended family, community, country, humanity as a whole. Each of these has its own narrative in which you and I are intertwined. Most important of all, though, is one story in particular, the story of God. God's story is actually at the center of the story of every human being who ever lived. Some of us know that, and some of us don't. And whether we do or do not know it, dramatically alters our own story. It is for this reason that the writer of the second letter of Timothy says in today's epistle, "As for you, continue in what you have learned and firmly believed, knowing from whom you learned it." Timothy says this because memory is important. So we must work to hold before us the memory of the story of God and how we are part of it. The thing is, we all know that there's a problem with this. Memory is unreliable. What we remember can change. It can shift over time. Memories can disappear altogether. We can simply forget. Even more important, things can vanish without a trace. We all know how memory can let us down when we most need it, such as when we're taking a test or when we're trying to remember the name of someone we know well, but which has suddenly slipped our minds. All this gets worse with age, of course. As many of you know, my mother died last spring at the age of 93. She was very fortunate to have retained much of her facilities for most of that time. She did decline in her later years, however. The first thing we noticed was how she began to talk about people and events that had long since gone, as if they were happening right in front of her and were still part of her life. She then began to, quote unquote, remember things that had never occurred. Apparently, her mind was creating events to fill gaps that she had begun to notice in her recent history. Then COVID came, and suddenly there were long periods when she just wasn't allowed to have any face-to-face visitors. She went downhill fast after that. By the time the restrictions finally began to lift, she often couldn't recognize even her closest family. She stared at them in confusion, and it was clear that she knew that she should know them, but she just couldn't place them. My sister Beverly was her most frequent visitor. She came almost every day. More often, Beverly would arrive only to find our mother sitting in bed staring at the ceiling. "Good morning, Mom," she'd say, but there'd be no response. Beverly would pull up a chair, begin to talk with her, but Mom would continue to stare at the ceiling as if no one was there at all. Fortunately, about that time, Beverly came across a large cache of letters that my mother had written years ago. My mother had always been a dedicated letter writer, writing a new letter to my father's mother every single week, usually several pages long, telling her all that had happened in the family over the past 7 days. Now, here all those letters were, hundreds of them, hundreds and hundreds, years and years worth. Together, they formed what amounted to a long diary spanning decades. Beverly began to read these letters aloud to my mother. And when she did, she found that my mother would immediately become more alert. As Beverly read, my mother would slowly turn to her. Her eyes would begin to focus. She was clearly listening. And when Beverly would pause, as she often did, and ask my mother about one thing or another, my mother would actually sometimes respond with a word or two, the only words she would ever speak. Parts of my mother's story, the story that my mother had told herself, were still there somewhere. The reading was helping her to bring it out again. And yet, little by little, my mother's individual story was slowly fading. It was giving away to the much larger story of which she was a part, her story with God. When I asked my sister at one point how our mother was doing, she took a deep breath and just smiled and said, "I think she's mostly with God now." And it was true. The thing is, memory is important because each of our stories is important. But in the end, every story gives way to something infinitely greater. It joins God's story. When that happens, all that we remember, all that we love, all that we hope for, all that has meaning for us, everything we are, in fact, will reconnect with the reality that is God. Our story and God's story will merge. And our story will add to God's story and make it richer and more complete. God will hold our memories and make them eternal because in the end, we are not defined by who we were, but in who we will become. Yes, memory is important, but we are much more than our memories. Our story is inseparable from God's story, And that story is never ending. God is eternal. And so are we. And that's true whether we remember it or not. Amen.